You know, the scale of D-Day, even 75 years later, remains hard to imagine. 156,000 troops, 23,000 paratroopers, 20,000 vehicles, 11,000 planes, 7,000 ships. Those just some of the numbers that show how massive the D-Day invasion really was. And joining us now, Tom Nichols, who is a professor at the U.S. Naval War College. Joining us now is Tom Nichols. Tom is a professor at the U.S. Naval War College. Tom, it's amazing when you look back 75 years later on D-Day and what got accomplished. 156,000 Allied fighters involved on the Allied side. How do you plan for what becomes the largest invasion in history?
An even better question is, how do you plan for the largest invasion in history when you've never done anything like this before? One of the things that's remarkable about D-Day is the intense amount of planning that went into something that no one had ever seen before. The paratroopers, for example, had practiced and practiced and practiced by doing night drops in England. But no one had ever tried to do this massive combined arms operation and put this many ships to sea and this many men in the air at the same time. It had just never been done. So to some extent, no matter how meticulous the planning, there was just so much they couldn't know. And that's why a lot of it went wrong. A lot of the airborne drops, for example, were miles off course. And a lot of the units had to simply reach out and find each other in the dark over the next 12 to 24 hours. So a huge amount of planning, but in the end, this was uncharted territory in every way for the Allies.
I'm curious how the plan matched with the execution of the plan. I mean, there were 10,000 Allied casualties on D-Day. Did the military leadership get the result out of this that they anticipated? And if not, how was the actual invasion different from what they had foreseen?
That's a great question. You could say that they got the result they wanted in May 1945. But there had been some false starts before that. There had been an attempted landing by the Canadians as a kind of first pass at this that ended in disaster. There were other alternatives that some of the Allies and Allied commanders thought were less dangerous. And so in some respects, it was a remarkable success, but there were also individual moments of disaster. I think it's fair to say that they achieved the goal they wanted to, but again, without really knowing how it was going to look once they were actually on the ground. So the first major surrender took place about 20 days later. And that was a remarkable timetable, considering that up until that moment, the whole of Europe had been controlled by Nazi Germany. So they did get the result they wanted, but with individual moments of great sacrifice and some cases of disaster, but also a few moments of great skill and daring and a huge dash of luck.
Tom, you mentioned that there were some other options on the table for military leadership. Do we know what those options were and why they were rejected in favor of D-Day?
Sure. There was the option that we started in Italy. Remember that just as the Allies were launching D-Day, Rome fell. And there was always the option to try to come up through the soft underbelly of Europe and to try to fight our way west and north into France and the Low Countries. That would have taken quite a long time. And there was another thing going on that's important to remember about D-Day, which is that up until this point, the Soviet Union had been fighting alone. And we were under immense pressure to open up a second front to try to relieve some of the pressure on what was then our ally. And so a more time-consuming, more meticulous approach of trying to go through Europe would have been very costly both for us and for our Soviet allies. And by 1944, we finally had enough experience, we had enough materiel, we had enough supply that we were able to do this incredibly daring experiment of crossing the channel.
I find myself wondering through the course of the last couple of days if we'll ever see something like D-Day again. I suspect we won't for any number of reasons, not the least of which is because we rely more on technology and our equipment to prosecute our wars than we do on individual soldiers or sailors. I'm curious whether you can ever conceive of a future D-Day equivalent, and if not, why?
I think your point is spot on. I think because of technology and the way, just the different way the world looks today, we're not going to see another D-Day. The number of bombers, for example, that it would take to destroy a target in 1944 would number in the dozens, when today the same level of destruction could be achieved with great precision by one or two pilots flying together, two aircraft. The other is that there aren't these great frontiers to invade. If you think about the way the world map looks, we simply don't have the same kind of huge contested spaces that are possible. That's not to say that there still isn't room for massive naval and ground battles, God forbid, in the 21st century. But the other thing to remember, and this is a kind of a dark note on a day of remembrance, is that the world would have looked very different in 1944 if everyone had had nuclear weapons. So you're not going to see another D-Day, because anything that gets to that point of desperation, there will be another solution that decision makers and leaders might want to gravitate to, and that would be incredibly dangerous. So in one way, we should be very grateful that we will never see another D-Day, but we should never forget it, because it was just an amazing feat of arms that will probably not be replicated again in our lifetimes.
Most of us, when we think of D-Day, think of the full frontal assault of Omaha Beach and the soldiers, climbing onto the beach and fighting their way up. There was more to it than that, including quite a bit of trickery. For example, General George Patton was trying to convince the Germans that the invasion was going to happen in Calais instead. So trickery did play quite a bit of a role here, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And General Patton didn't enjoy that role. Patton wanted to be in there fighting and not sitting around and acting like a decoy. But of course, Patton had made some mistakes and had made himself unemployable for a while because of his treatment of a soldier. But deception was key. There were also things like fake tanks and cardboard cutouts and things that were set up to try to fool German spotters. That's another reason, by the way, that there probably won't be another D-Day. The world's a lot more transparent than it used to be. It's a lot harder to achieve that kind of surprise. But yes, deception, luring troops out of position, convincing the Germans not to reinforce certain areas because they simply couldn't believe that the attack was coming from one direction as opposed to another. All crucial, as well as, I think, one of the most important parts of D-Day as well as the airborne campaign, which put at 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning, put hundreds and hundreds of men behind the lines, sometimes too far behind the lines, long in advance of the actual invasion.
Finally, Tom, most Americans have no experience in the military, can't really conceive of what it would be like to serve in a war, much less to serve in D-Day, or facing the notion of being boated up to this beach and facing what I can only assume would be the prospect of certain or likely death. What do we know about the mindset of our soldiers who were involved in D-Day, what they experienced as, the shoreline of France approached?
Not being a veteran myself, I can only report what I've heard people who have been in combat from Vietnam to the Gulf all the way back to D-Day report about it. And there is a lot of them report a strange mindset that says they were certain that the guy next to them would die, but not them, which is a very normal human thing. But also just intense fear that then gets overtaken by training. And I think that's a really important thing to understand about our fellow citizens who serve in the military or in any stressful position, firefighters, police officers. That bravery is not the absence of fear. It's the overcoming of that fear, particularly with training, that they had been drilled and drilled and drilled, so that at some point their responses became almost automatic in the face of this incredible withering fire that they were taking coming onto the beaches. That's really a remarkable testimony to the people who train military people, who have to train them and then send them off. And not be with them in many cases when they go. That's a crucially important part that veterans have related to me. That they will tell you that what really saved their lives was not any massive act of bravery, but just overcoming their fear by feeling their training kicking in and engaging them as they went into battle.
Tom Nichols is a professor at the U.S. Naval War College. Tom, thanks for adding some really important color to our coverage of such an important day.
Thank you for having me.
And up next, President Trump speaking at Normandy today and giving a rather presidential speech. We're going to look at his foreign policy and speculate about how a Trump might have handled a day like D-Day, as well as the Marshall Plan that followed. Would America First have been thrown out the window?